Alright, this presentation is meant to give an understanding of how Fatal Vision products, especially Fatal Vision goggles, can be used to produce a more integrative program. My name is Emily Braga. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm getting my PhD in journalism and mass communication, looking at how people respond to media messages, particularly political messages, and how we can change attitudes, behaviors, and their identification. We've come up with this presentation as a means to make sure that people using the product, using our Fatal Vision goggles, are doing so as part of an evidence-based approach. So what do we mean by evidence-based? Well, it means two things, that we're using relevant theory and actual empirical research to demonstrate the potential of the goggles themselves and of the program. So we're drawing from research on Fatal Vision goggles themselves. So people have done studies, looked at the effectiveness of using these goggles. We're going to present those to you and talk about what they mean. We're also going to draw from relevant theories about attitude and behavioral change. So ultimately, our goal with using Fatal Vision goggles is to produce sustained attitude change that leads to behavior change. We hope that people get a better understanding of drinking and driving and its implications, and hopefully do it a bit less. Why is this so important? Well, in understanding why Fatal Vision products are effective, we can increase the effectiveness of our program. So what causes attitude change? What reinforces that attitude change? In an understanding, in an attempt to make sure these products are working as part of this program. To start out with, why do people drink and drive? It seems like such an obvious question. There are three factors that really encourage people to drink and drive. First, people have optimistic biases. They don't think they're going to get caught, and they don't think that even if they do, there's much threat. So the idea of an optimistic bias is people don't want to believe bad things can happen to them. They want to believe that they have some kind of protection in place, whether they're smarter, they're faster, they're ready to deal with any kind of situation that arises. So when they think about something like drinking and driving, they might even recognize that other people can get hurt. So somebody else who drinks and drives, they might be in some trouble. They might be a danger to others. Myself, I have a lot of mechanisms in place. I'm used to drinking in a lot of situations. And so I know how to deal with it. I'm going to be able to compensate. I'm going to be able to just drive slower, whatever my mechanism is. I'm not going to believe that I'm going to get caught, that I'm going to get hurt. There are also social norms that kind of reinforce this position. Both drinking and driving separately are habitual accepted behaviors. It's completely understood that you're going to go out, you're going to drink, you drive into the bar, it's full of cars. People there are drinking and driving. And people think, hey, this isn't so bad. So the combination of these factors is often seen as okay. This isn't an overwhelming norm, and we'll get to why there are norms also against this behavior, but in general, people don't see that this is so big of a problem. Again, partly because of their optimistic biases, partly because these are just norms in our society. And lastly, with any behavior or attitude change, there are barriers to alternatives. So drinking and driving is easy. You drive your car to the bar or wherever you're performing these drinking behaviors, and then you leave in your car. If you want to search out alternatives, there are time costs. You've got to think about, okay, I need a designated driver, we need to pick who that is, or we need to get the cab company and call them in advance and wait for them to come, and then I have to come back and get my car the next day. Or I have to research in advance, what are the alternative transportations, like taking a bus, I've got to know the schedule. Along with that, there's effort and there's money. Cabs are expensive, getting back to your car the next day can be expensive. Yeah.
In regard to optimistic biases, you said you had mechanisms that might help you deal with drinking and driving. Mm-hmm. But aren't those mechanisms based on reality, that maybe you really do have mechanisms that allow you to drive better?
People are more likely to think they have control over a situation than they actually do. So one of the places that optimistic biases are most prevalent is when people perceive they have control. Yes, people have mechanisms in place to some extent to deal with their drinking behaviors, especially habitual drinkers. But one of the things we know about alcohol consumption is that everyone's susceptible. No matter how good you think you are, there are cognitive impairments, there are physical impairments that cannot be completely avoided. So the point of optimistic bias is, yeah, people might have some mechanisms in place that help them deal with their drinking behaviors, but they're never as good as they think they are.
So they may be overestimating the effectiveness of
That's a great way of thinking about it. People are overestimating their ability, overestimating their compensation. So how do we change these behaviors? How do we change attitudes? When it comes to perceptions of threat, it's driven largely by two components: how susceptible you are, as well as how severe that problem is. So a great example of this would be your susceptibility to the common flu. People think they're relatively susceptible, they might get a cold, so they're willing to engage in some behaviors, whether it's washing their hands or covering their mouth when they sneeze or taking cold medicine. But the severity isn't all that high. If you get the flu, it's uncomfortable, you spend a few days in bed. It's not the most pleasant time of your life, but the end result isn't so bad. On the other side, we have getting struck by lightning. This is very severe. If you get struck by lightning, you're in a lot of trouble. You face serious injury, you face potential death. But you find yourself very low susceptibility. You don't believe you're going to get struck by lightning. So there's not much you do about it, right? You might go inside if there's a rainstorm, but for the most part, you aren't engaged in preventative behaviors throughout your life to avoid getting struck by lightning. So when you're trying to change someone's behavior, when it's in a risk situation, one of the most important things to target is their susceptibility. If people think that this is something that could happen to them, they're more likely to engage in behavioral change. You also want it to be severe. Again, if it's not that big a deal, why take sometimes arduous decisions? Why put all that effort into changing? But susceptibility is really one of the key components. When you're trying to get people to change behaviors, there are 4 different ways you can target it. You need to convince them of the benefits of change, that it's worth their time, that there's going to be some kind of benefit to themselves. You also have to lower their barriers to change. So when people think, yeah, this would be a great idea, but I can't change it. I would love to win the lottery. I'm completely convinced of the benefit of it. There's lots of barriers to that. Mostly it's random and I have no way of dealing with it. If you could somehow convince me that there's a foolproof method, you can bet I would engage in that behavior. Subjective norms are also really important, and this is particularly true for all age groups, but especially for young adults. They really they care about what their peers think, they care about what others think about them. If there are subjective norms, social norms saying this behavior is okay or you don't need to change, it's going to be really difficult to encourage change. However, if you really get people to believe that there are norms in place that encourage them to change, that they're not fulfilling what society thinks is important, you're much likely to produce that change. And lastly, perceived behavioral control. So maybe the lottery example is better here. I'm completely convinced that there's a benefit, but I don't have much perceived control. So to really change attitudes and behavior, we should target each of these factors. We should encourage people to think about the benefits of changing. We should reduce their barriers. We should introduce them to subjective social norms that tell them change is expected, change is okay, change is desirable. And lastly, we should tell them this is something you can do, this is something you have control over.
In regard to threat or risk, I'm wondering if that is the intent of what we call red asphalt movies that show carnage as a result of a drunk driving crash. It's kind of getting across the severity, at least, of these incidents. But I know the research is somewhat mixed in the effectiveness of that approach. Is it that they're not addressing all of these variables, perhaps?
I also think that they're not addressing susceptibility very well. So people can say, yeah, drunk driving's bad. I can see that it's going to hurt people, but it's not going to happen to me. Again, I am in control of myself. I'm better able of dealing with the drinking and driving successfully. So I think without personal susceptibility, severity isn't that great. It's, again, for them, it's the lightning strike. Yeah, this could be really bad, but the probability of it happening to me is very low, and it's even lower because I think I'm so much better than everyone else at controlling my behavior when drinking.
And part of that is the issue of optimistic bias, that because of that, they don't think they're as susceptible as everybody else.
They think other people might be susceptible, but they aren't.
And I suspect that what we're talking about are strategies at getting at that.
Exactly. Okay. And that's one of the things that the fatal vision goggles do very well, is get at personal susceptibility and undercut optimistic bias to some extent. So, how do fatal vision goggles work? People underestimate the threat of drunk driving. We've talked about this, especially in terms of their susceptibility. People do usually recognize the severity of a crash. It's very hard to say, if I crash while drunk driving, everyone will be fine. But they believe they're not susceptible because of those optimistic biases. They believe they can handle alcohol impairment. Fatal vision products undermine that belief. When wearing these goggles, we're demonstrating very clearly that they cannot control their actions when impaired. They are, in fact, susceptible to the problems of alcohol impairment, and therefore increases their threat. So people wearing these goggles aren't able to perform simple tasks. They're not good at dribbling the basketball. They're not good at navigating a cone course. There's a lot of ways that we demonstrate, hey, you think that you can deal with this, but we're actually demonstrating you're not very good, you're not as good as you think, and that undercuts your optimistic bias somewhat, increases your perceived susceptibility. Research using fatal vision goggles have supported this explanation. There have been 3 separate academic studies published in these peer-reviewed journals that demonstrate wearing fatal vision goggles leads to lowered intentions of drinking and driving, greater perceptions of risk. This is especially true among heavier drinkers, those with more self-efficacy, which I'll describe who they are in just a second, and those who think drunk driving does indeed cause crashes. The last one's a great example of optimistic bias. People who already can admit, hey, drunk driving leads to crashes, are those who are less likely to have those optimistic biases in place. So what we see is fatal vision goggles are a really effective product among all these groups of people, and there's empirical evidence out there suggesting they are effective in the ways that we suggest they are. Again, primarily through that increased susceptibility. However, while there's a lot of evidence of short-term behavior, attitude change, they understand drinking and driving is bad, they even report intentions of less drinking and driving in the future. We've seen less evidence of sustained behavioral change. We're really great at getting them to think, yeah, this is a bad thing, I don't want to do that. We've been less successful in getting them to change their behaviors long-term. And that's what this program is designed to help do. Help them translate those intentions that we're already targeting well into actual behavioral change. Part of the problem with these studies is they've only used goggles to perform activities. There's been little discussion of the meaning behind the goggles. So they say, here, put these on, and people find, oh, I can't dribble a basketball. But there's no kind of understanding of how that fits into the broader picture. So if we think back as to what produces attitude, behavioral change, it wasn't only barriers or subjective norms or perceived behavioral control. It's also benefits. And we need to address each of those in turn to really increase the chances, increase the likelihood that we're actually changing people's behaviors. So what we're doing is using theories that apply to behavioral change to develop this more effective program, utilizing the goggles in this sense. So the first thing we can do is threat reinforcement. So part of this program can include highlighting the severity of drunk driving outcomes. Crash descriptions are a great example. The red asphalt program that you mentioned earlier would be another great example. If we can increase the severity, we're increasing threat. But even more important is highlighting the susceptibility. So again, going back to optimistic bias, people are more likely to have optimistic biases, are more likely to believe that they're going to come out better, they're going to avoid negative situations better when they believe they have control, when it's a negative outcome, a stigmatized outcome. So getting in a crash because you were drinking and driving is certainly one of those negative outcomes that people want to avoid. And it's personally relevant. They actually think they're going to be in this situation. They actually can believe, hey, I might drink and drive at some point in the future. What are some mechanisms to undermine optimistic bias? Well, using the goggles themselves. Again, we're demonstrating you are susceptible. Your ways of dealing with alcohol consumption aren't perhaps as good as you think. But we also want to discuss the inevitability and uncontrollability of the effects of alcohol impairment. So again, if optimistic bias is driven by, I have control, I can deal with the outcomes, and I'm not going to be effective, we need to demonstrate that, no, you don't. Alcohol consumption has this pretty normal effect on people, and it's completely uncontrollable. You might have some mechanisms in place, but they're not good enough. They're not going to compensate to the point that you're going to be able to drink and drive effectively. And then also using personal and relevant examples. So optimistic bias works especially well when we can say, I'm not like that person. That person is not as smart as me. They're not as fast as me. I'm going to have better mechanisms in place. So when we use examples in our programs, we should make sure that they are really specific to the group of people we're targeting. If we're talking about middle schoolers, talking about, the risks, well, middle school perhaps is a bit young to drink and drive, hopefully. But if we're talking to high schoolers, we don't want to give them examples of 30-year-olds who got in crashes. They're going to say, well, I'm young, I'm fast, I'm smart, I'm, got going to be just fine. We want to use personal examples. We want to use relevant examples. We want them to come up with their own examples, and barring that, at least come up with examples of other high schoolers, people who look very similar, because then they're less able to say, I'm different, I'm better.
In regard to optimistic biases, I mean, it seems that it's very much a part of our nature, that, at least I understand it anecdotally, that most people think they're better than most others in anything they do. Why is that? Why is that a part of our nature?
Optimistic bias is first and foremost a way of protecting our ego. We want to believe we have control over the situation. We don't want to think that we're susceptible to random events. Those are very scary for us if we feel like we can't control things. So going back to the example of gambling, people who gamble tend to have mechanisms in place that they think are going to increase their likelihood of succeeding. Whether it's, having a rabbit foot in their pocket or rubbing the machine the right way or whispering 3 times to it. They think that they have actions that they can take that are going to increase their chances of success. And that's just another example of an optimistic bias. It's an example of people trying to exert their control over a situation, even situations over which they don't have much control. And again, that's to protect themselves, to protect the thought that I could be killed tomorrow or injured tomorrow or lose all my money tomorrow and I have no control. That's something that people don't want to admit. So optimistic biases do have this really important function, but when it prevents people from performing desired behaviors, when it leads them to believe they can perform behaviors that have potentially negative outcomes, that's when we really need to start undermining it. So we'll never get rid of optimistic bias altogether. If we convince these teens or whoever's in this program that they're less able to drink and drive, they'll probably still use their rabbit foot when they gamble or wiggle their butt 3 times before they take a golf shot. But hopefully they won't believe that they can drink and drive without having any consequences.
So optimistic bias, I suppose, then had its place in our development, because we might not have gone after that mastodon and killed it for food if we thought we were going to be killed. So it kind of perhaps is an important part of progress and being able to take risks and trying things.
It is. If we were always imperiled by the thought of, oh my gosh, how severe is this? How susceptible am I? We might not do anything. I might not get in my car tomorrow if I really started thinking about, here are all the things that could happen to me and calculating the risks. So optimistic bias can be a good thing, but in this case it's so strong to the point where people sometimes deny evidence that really might protect them in dangerous situations.
Okay, so that results then in denial of some... Okay.
So I talked before about social norms being an important part of changing behavior. When it comes to drinking and driving, we have 2 competing norms in place. The first is the one I talked about, that drinking and driving is seen as habitual, acceptable, normal even. Again, when you pull up into a bar, it's full with cars, and those people in the bar are probably drinking. If you go to a sporting event, people are going to drink, and then they're going to drive home in their cars. This is seen as just 2 things that we combine, and it's normal. Yet at the same time, people see drinking and driving as dangerous. A recent study demonstrated that 80% of people thought it was dangerous to their personal safety and the safety of their family when people combine drinking and driving. So we have both of these norms in our society. One, that it's okay, but 2, that it's very dangerous. And one thing that we're going to really want to do in this program is reinforce the desired norm. So we want to discuss, one of the ways of doing this would be discussing the acceptability of drinking and driving. So I think a lot of people might say, 1 drink's okay, but if we start talking about, hey, how acceptable is it to drive after you've had 6 drinks in an hour? You might start hearing a lot of people say, hey, that's not okay, or is it okay to drive while drunk? Asking that question might provoke some of that desired response, and people will then start seeing that, hey, social norms aren't just drinking and driving's okay, but also that drunk driving is not acceptable. So one of the things we want to do is kind of reframe that debate, start getting people to talk about the inacceptability of drunk driving rather than the acceptability of drinking and driving. Those are kind of 2 separate things. We can also reinforce the second norm, the desired norm, by demonstrating that impairment is real and dangerous, and that is exactly what our goggles are doing. We are saying, here, let's see how you perform when you're dealing with the visual impairment that drinking gives you, and people are going to see they're not doing all that well. So using that to reinforce the second norm, that drinking and driving, that drunk driving specifically, is not an okay behavior, it is in fact a dangerous behavior, should help us reinforce that second norm. We can also talk about the social endorsements of alternatives. So In our society, there are a lot of things in place that try to encourage people to not drink or drive after drinking. So, for example, any safe ride programs that colleges might have are a great example that people know drinking and driving is okay, that society knows that drinking and driving leads to bad outcomes. Any designated driver program, so a lot of bars have in place the designated driver gets free soft drinks all night. That's a place where our society is saying, yes, we acknowledge that this is something we have to deal with. In Madison, Wisconsin, we have free bus service on New Year's Eve. Again, society's demonstrating that we need to find ways to get around drunk driving. So talking about those demonstrates that not only do you individually might think, hey, drunk driving's dangerous, but society itself has learned ways to adapt. And one of the reasons this is so important is that research tells us that highlighting the conservative social norms that kind of underlie these perceptions can limit drinking. It can limit the start of alcohol consumption among youth. It can limit the dangerous behaviors that result from it. So the conservative norms, people often assume that the first is the only norm that's out there, that drinking and driving is okay. If we can demonstrate to them that most of their peers, most of society also recognizes the second, that drunk driving is not acceptable, that it's dangerous, that it can hurt our families and hurt our safety, we have a better chance of making our program succeed.
You may be getting to this in a subsequent slide, but I recall something about where the opinions of peers matters as well. That if you believe that your peers would frown on this type of behavior, you may be more likely to conform to a conservative social norm.
Yep, I will be talking more about that in just a second. But that is a really important component of behavioral change. So the theory of planned behavior, the theory of reasoned action, both suggest that one of the components of change is that you perceive others are encouraging that change, that others want that change to occur.
And just a comment, and perhaps it's just an outcome of our society being tolerant or trying to accommodate a lot of different views and beliefs, that we even have a legal limit in place, which I think also may send conflicting messages that society accepts some level of drinking under .08, which I think also serves to confuse people as to what the right behavior may be.
Right, and it reinforces the first norm, that drinking and driving is okay within limits. So that can also be very challenging to deal with. So that's why it's so important to really get people to think about the second norm as well, that drinking up to a certain point, yeah, okay maybe, but drunk driving is not acceptable. And people often forget that and thinking, oh, I'm okay, that optimistic bias again, I've only had 2 beers, or I've only had, maybe 2 beers isn't the problem, but I've only had 2 margaritas. And that's where you get into some difficulty. So going back to what you were just talking about, the motivation to comply. So people care about others' opinions, especially among youth. They want to know that they're accepted by their peers, by their parents, by their friends, by their family. And so we need to extend this concern to worry about reactions to alcohol impairment. So if people start thinking that my peers, my friends are going to mock me or think less of me if I behave in these dangerous ways after drinking, they're going to be more likely to change their behaviors. They don't want to be mocked. They really don't want to be laughed at. So in discussion, what we want to do is elicit descriptions of negative effects of alcohol impairment. So get people to talk about times where themselves are more likely, their friends were in situations that they found dangerous or unacceptable or just absurd in some way. So driving badly, scaring passengers, that fender bender you had, or hitting a parked car, or tripping and hurting yourself. All of those are situations where if people start seeing their peers are not accepting of these behaviors, that they were frightened, that they were angry, or that they found you amusing, that's inducing this motivation to comply, inducing people to think, hey, I should change because my peers don't find this very cool. So focus on people's adverse reactions to these scenarios. So not he tripped and it was so funny, but I was really worried when he fell down those stairs, or he fell down those stairs and couldn't play basketball for 3 weeks and we lost the tournament, or whatever those negative outcomes are, really focusing on them. Have groups come up with these scenarios. So it'd be much better rather than presenting a scenario. There was once this guy who fell down the stairs. Having them instead come up with them, it's much more personal, it's much more relevant. They actually see its effectiveness in their own life. And again, we undercut optimistic bias to some extent. It's my peers wouldn't laugh at me. Well, look at your peers are laughing at everyone else. So earlier I mentioned that people with high self-efficacy tended to have more favorable reactions to the goggles. They were more likely to reduce their likelihood of drinking and driving. What does efficacy mean? Well, there's two types that really matter when we're talking about behavioral change. Response efficacy, that the behavior will achieve your desired goals, and self-efficacy, your personal ability to change your behaviors. So efficacy itself just means ability to do something, your effectiveness. Are you actually able? So response is this behavior able to do what I want it to do? And self, can I do what I want to do? And again, that higher self-efficacy already shown to be good for goggle effectiveness. So what can we do to heighten these two forms of efficacy to make this part of a program? First, we can address response efficacy. Again, the goggles are demonstrating that alcohol consumption matters for your abilities, and limiting alcohol therefore improves abilities. If we can make that link more salient, if we can make it more prominent, people will start seeing, hey, if I don't drink, I'm likely to be a better driver. I'm likely to not put myself in dangerous situations. So changing this behavior will achieve my goal of avoiding social norms. Again, so we just talked about, hey, are my peers going to mock me? If they're mocking me when I'm drinking, changing that behavior will lead to more peer acceptance. Maybe not getting to crashes. Yeah.
Now, would it also include taking advantage of a designated driver or calling a cab?
Yeah. If people start seeing that the undesired outcome is getting pulled over, getting in a crash, any behavior that they perceive helps them avoid that, that's increasing their response efficacy. Believing that changing some kind of behavior, whether it is simply having a designated driver or whether it's avoiding drinking altogether, helps them achieve some goal, whatever that goal might be. If the goal is only drinking and driving, then yeah, a designated driver. If it's also to avoid peer ridicule, maybe drinking a little bit less is the response that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. We refer to that as our calls to action.
Right.
And those actions that people can take to minimize their exposure to that risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so really highlighting that these behaviors actually do achieve desired goals will increase response efficacy.
So, Emily, what you're really talking about, too, through all of these discussions is to really elicit input from everybody in the group so that they do feel that peer pressure right there.
Yes, that's a great example. So one of the things we know about using the goggles is they are most effective when you put them on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's partly because of these optimistic biases. Oh, Julia over there, she's not as used to drinking as I am, or she's not as smart as I am. Versus when you put them on yourself, you're like, oh, oops, guess I'm not as good as I thought.
Never mind.
Right, and so using social norms as well in discussion is a great way of really boosting the effectiveness. So this is all, again, about using the goggles as part of this integrative program that's targeting all these different reasons that people might change their behaviors.
Okay.
So we can also address self-efficacy by discussing feasible alternatives to drinking and driving. So am I actually able to perform these behaviors? People might drink and drive in part because they don't think they're able to not. If we give them ways, if we give them the recognition that in fact they are, that will help. Success in altering others or their own behavior. So get them to talk about times they were actually effective in achieving a goal. Maybe it's they got someone to call a cab, or they took the keys from a friend, or they realized they were drunk and stopped drinking for 2 hours before they drove, or whatever those are. Getting them to elicit instances where they themselves were able to change their behavior in the way they wanted makes them feel, yes, I'm able to do it again.
Would a barrier to self-efficacy be that social pressure of not appearing cool if they're not drinking with the group?
That's one of the reasons that what's so important with role-playing to counter social pressures is also having that discussion about conservative norms. So resistance training, giving people examples, for example, through role-play, of how they deal with social pressures is an important way of changing behaviors, of increasing efficacy and resistance to alcohol. But what we found is that tends not to be effective unless it's also addressing conservative norms. And what we think is happening to some extent is that by telling people you're going to have to resist all this pressure, you're going to look completely uncool, and we're going to have to give you all these mechanisms, people are starting to think, wow, social norms are, I should be drinking and driving. If I need all this training just to resist, then clearly I'm going to be the uncool one. Which is why it's so important to combine these two. We have to demonstrate that people's underlying desires, people's underlying views about drunk driving is that it's unacceptable. If we only say you're going to have to resist, we're gonna actually not get the motivation to comply. We'll increase the motivation to not comply. So we need motivation to comply to work where we see them understanding that the peer norms, that the peer pressures around them are encouraging this behavioral change, encouraging not to drunk drive or drive after drinking.
And those are the conservative norms that you're referring to?
Those are the conservative norms I'm referring to. The idea that people often think everyone's doing it, everyone thinks it's fine. If we demonstrate, hey, everyone's not doing it, not everyone thinks it's fine, including those peers whose opinions matter the most to you, that's where we get the motivation to comply, to work for us rather than against us. Part of this, of course, is reducing barriers. So self-efficacy works by believing I can, in fact, achieve my goal. Anything that gets in the way of that, any barrier, anything that makes that more difficult, reduces your self-efficacy. If you want to change your behavior, but you think, oh, I don't even know where to begin, you're not going to feel very efficacious. So there are practical behaviors to behavioral change in this scenario. Time, money, effort, all of those things we talked about before, kind of against not drinking and driving. So again, you have to pay the cab, or you have to pay your bus fare, or you need to, beforehand, you need to figure out who's going to be the designated driver and how you're going to do all that. So one of the discussions we need to elicit is methods for reducing these costs. So make a game out of planning designated drivers. Talk about ways to make this more fun. You know, you get to be the person that tells the stories, or whatever that is. Get them to come up, brainstorm themselves ways that they could get a designated driver ahead of time. Talk about sharing taxis. Give them taxi information. Give them how to research bus routes. Give them all those tools that are necessary. So not only are you reducing the barriers to behavioral change, you're making them feel that they can in fact do it. So again, this works very closely with efficacy. When people think that I can do this, there aren't these barriers, I know how to get around them or over them, or just, ignore them, then they're more likely to actually achieve behavioral change. One of the most important things here is, again, using local information. Make that information available, whether it's a card that has all the taxi numbers, or the bus routes, or the website. Giving them that information anytime that we can reduce a chance later on where they say, I am kind of drunk, maybe I shouldn't drive, but I don't know how to get a cab, and I don't want to deal with this, and all of those situations, every time we reduce one of those barriers, we increase the chance that their intention becomes a behavior. And that's where intentions and behaviors need to really be distinguished. Intentions are a large part of behavior, a great predictor, one of the best ways we have of deciding who's going to actually perform a behavior in the future. But they're not exactly the same thing. Commitment creates consistency. So once people commit to something, once they say, I am this, or I plan to do this, when they fail, it creates really uncomfortable arousal. They don't like feeling like, I believe this, but I did this. It's something people try to avoid. People will work to match their attitudes to behaviors. So as soon as we get them to express an attitude, express a behavioral intention, I intend not to drink and drive, I recognize that drunk driving is a problem, they're going to have internal pressures to continue that belief, to enact it out. So there are two kind of different ways we've seen this really happening. One is using a foot in the door technique, which is about, again, small commitments leading to big commitments. So as soon as you say yes to small favor, so salesmen use this really very often, or people who are trying to get money for social causes, say, will you donate $5? And a lot of people say, oh yeah, $5. They come back a week later, those people who donated $5 are more likely to give $50 because they've committed themselves to a particular course of action. They think of themselves as a social activist or whatever the social good is you're promoting. What we can do is get people to express concerns about small things, about abilities on small matters. So one of the social norms, and especially in American society, is people have control over their own lives. We don't like telling people what to do, especially, again, among youth. The last thing they want is to be told what to do or have others telling them what to do. So there's, to some extent, a norm against saying, hey, you're not able to drink and drive. We need to make that norm easier to overcome. Get them first to say, hey, would you want that kid on your basketball team? He's dribbling around, he can't make a shot. It's pretty easy in that situation to say no, and people aren't going to feel nearly as uncomfortable as saying, hey, that person shouldn't drive. But once they've agreed to that small thing, once they've committed and said, yeah, this person is not in control, they're more likely to then agree, hey, this person shouldn't be driving as well. So concern about a very small problem can lead to concern about a bigger problem. Getting them to commit to some kind of behavior or attitude leads to that bigger, larger commitment. And secondly, the idea of hypocrisy. So people do not want to feel like they're not living up to what they preach. If they're telling other people they should do something, they feel like they themselves should do it. So one of the techniques that's been effective in other health behaviors, as well as social conservation behaviors, is getting people to make some kind of statement, sign a petition, do a written statement, a recorded statement where they say, you should perform this behavior. Then remind them or ask them to think themselves of all the times they themselves have failed. So one of the places this has been used is with condom use. So have somebody say, you should use condoms when you're having sex. Most people would probably preach that. And then ask them, hey, every time have you had sex, have you used a condom? Or get them to list the number of times that they didn't. What they found is not only did people increase their behavioral intentions of using a condom, when they came back to these same people weeks later, they actually were using condoms more. And we've seen this with a lot of things like water conservation. So getting people to think themselves, commit themselves publicly to saying, yes, drunk driving is bad. And again, this shouldn't be too hard to do. No one seems to think drunk driving is good. And then ask them to think about all the times they themselves have failed to live up to this ideal that they're espousing. Whether it's drinking and driving themselves, or whether it's being in a car and watching their friend driving when they shouldn't be. This will lead to stronger behavioral intentions and ultimately behavioral change. So again, getting these people's desire for internal consistency, to know that their attitudes match their behaviors, that they aren't telling other people, you should do this, but I'm not going to. People don't want to feel like hypocrites. Getting them to commit to the behavioral intention of not drunk driving leads them to be more likely to not drunk drive. So
in other words, getting them to realize their own failure is increasing the desire to be more consistent with their stated norm.
Right. Although if you just ask them to recognize their own failures, you can lead to decreased self-efficacy. So it's really important to get them first to commit, publicly commit. I preach this. Drunk driving is not okay. And then say, oh, but there have been times I haven't lived up to it. They're going to want to live up to this ideal that they have committed themselves to publicly. So commitment, internal commitment is important. What strengthens that is external commitment, because then you get the motivation to comply, right? So the social norms start kicking in once you say, I say you should not drink and drive. And then I'm out drinking and driving, and I think, wow, all my peers just saw me saying that. They're going to think I'm a hypocrite. I should not do this. So the public commitment's an important part of that, making them feel like social norms now enforce their motivation to comply, enforce this decision.
Well, it's interesting that we would combine them even in a workshop like this, where first you work on their intention and then publicly get them to commit. It's like a double barrel.
And this is great because one of the things we do know from research into fatal vision goggles is they are effective in promoting these intentions. Mm-hmm. People do say, yeah, I'm going to drink and drive less. What we haven't been as successful doing is turning that intention into behavior. Right. So all of these steps that we're kind of highlighting are meant to, one, boost their intention, but even perhaps more importantly, help them translate the intention into behavior. Give them the efficacy, both in terms of themselves and in terms of their response, to say, yeah, I can make this intention happen. Give them the motivation to do so, and give them the tools, reduce the barriers, so that when they're out in a drinking situation, they remember, hey, I was against this, and they have the tools in place. Not only, I don't want to drink and drive, but I don't see an alternative, but I don't want to drink and drive, and here's the taxi cab number right in my pocket. So throughout all of these discussions, it's really important to draw on the idea of motivational interviewing. So one of the things we know, and again, this is especially true among young adults, self-persuasion is the most effective technique of producing change. People don't like to be told what to do, and they resist difficult behavioral change. So this is something that's been used a lot or talked about a lot within both alcoholics and people who are addicted to cigarettes or addicted to tobacco. They might recognize that, hey, this is not a healthy behavior, but it's really hard to change. So encourage people to think through their conflict. In this situation, it's two competing things that they want. They enjoy drinking. People really like it for the most part. But they also recognize the dangers of impairment, and hopefully they'll recognize it even more throughout this program. What we need them to do is use kind of accurate empathy or reflective listening. So the job of the person is not to say, you shouldn't drink and drive. People will say, yeah, I know that, but it's really hard, and they'll start coming up with reasons to resist you. Again, anyone who has children or who has worked with children knows if you tell them you shouldn't do this, the first thing they want to do is go out and do it. Instead, what you want them to do is come to the recognition themselves. So get them to talk through this inconsistency. highlighting the things that, yeah, drinking and driving is bad, impairment is dangerous, and kind of helping them work through the second one, but I enjoy drinking. So what can you do to encourage, to still have this drinking ability without the dangers? Or what are some steps you can take to make sure that you get both of these? You want to increase their awareness of the inconsistency, help them come up with the solutions on their own. So reflective listening does not mean just nodding your head and saying yes, yes, whatever you say, but kind of encouraging them to think in productive lines, encouraging them to think, okay, drinking and driving is dangerous. I enjoy drinking. What are the steps I can take to maintain both to some extent? So direct the conversation into what they can do. That's going to increase their self-efficacy, increase their motivation, and limits that defensive response where they just say, I really enjoy it, I'll be fine. I'm better than my peers, I will figure it out. So again, this defensive mechanism, people are going to not want to change their behaviors when it's difficult, especially when someone else tells them to. But it's when they themselves start recognizing, hey, I need to change, that we're going to have the most effective and the most success.
Now, motivational interviewing is really more of a skill that's employed by the instructor of this curriculum.
Yes.
Is that right?
It definitely is. So ultimately, there are just kind of a few steps to take. Try to avoid getting in their face. Try to avoid telling them what to do and encouraging them instead themselves or in a group to work through their problems. This conflict is probably not one person's. It's everyone who enjoys drinking, but recognizes that drinking and driving is dangerous. As a group, rather than have the authoritative figure come in and say, do not drink and drive, get them to talk through this, get them to come up with things on themselves. And that's kind of what the underlying thread of all the discussions we've been talking about, but just kind of reinforcing that and limit their ability to try and resist you to some extent.
I suspect it's a lot easier for people just to tell others what not to do.
Yes.
That it's more expedient to cut to the chase and
lay
on the line.
It certainly seems so, but it tends to be a bit less effective, especially, again, among youth who do not want to be told what to do.
Well, plus, then if you do that, then they already know what you want their answer to be. I mean, they're smart enough to guess that, but getting them to work it out on their own, if you can lead that conversation smoothly, I can see where that would be helpful.
And lastly, one of the most important things to recognize when using the goggles is that the goggles only simulate visual impairment. So they're great at doing that. People, again, wear the goggles and recognize, hey, I'm impaired. I'm not really as well able to compensate as I think. But we need to emphasize throughout this program, and especially during goggle use, right before, right after, during it, that alcohol causes mental impairment as well. It's not just things are blurry and it's hard to see. You're also thinking a bit slower. You have more to work through. One step we can take to kind of approximate this cognitive impairment is by increasing cognitive load. So one of the things we know about working memory is that people can't multitask very well. They have a limited amount of space of dealing with situations that arise. And one of the things alcohol does is kind of narrow that even further. They're not great multitaskers. So one step that might be really effective is while wearing the goggles, ask people to remember a long number. It decreases their cognitive resources available because part of their brain is really busy remembering this number. They have to think, okay, what is the number? Throughout their activities, they have less mental ability to kind of compensate for the visual impairment, much like they would have if they were drinking. So, for example, a great task might be remember the cute guy or the cute girl's number, right? They need to remember this number so they can go write it down or enter it into their iPhone or wherever they're going to put it while they're wearing these goggles. And then they have less ability to kind of deal with the impairment that the goggles uses, and it simulates to some extent the cognitive impairment that drinking implies. Even with this task, we still want to make sure that throughout the program we're saying, this is visual impairment. Just imagine you also have the cognitive impairment that drinking provides.
So this is part of increasing the susceptibility.
Yes. So this is yet another area where you're susceptible. You think you can compensate? One, you can't. And two, you have way more mental resources available right now than you ever will have when you're drinking.
So is there a magic number? I noticed that you say the cute guy or girl's number. That's a 7-digit number. Is there a certain number you shouldn't use because it's too short, or?
What the research has tended to show us is numbers 6, 7, 8 digits, somewhere in there. So the cute guy or girl's number was easy because it's 7 digits, and some research has suggested 7 is the magic number for cognitive load. Too many more, they just kind of give up. too few, it's not using enough of their cognitive resources.
Okay.
So, what has all of this changed? This hasn't actually changed how the goggles work. This program, using this evidence-based approach, bringing theory in, isn't changing the way goggles do their thing, right? Goggles still work through primarily increasing people's susceptibility. But what this evidence-based approach is meant to do is increase the effectiveness by embedding this in a program where people understand what they're trying to do, people's intentions, which, again, we already know we're effective at changing them just by wearing the goggles. Those intentions can actually become behaviors. And lastly, giving instructors kind of a common language of discussing this process. So a lot of people who are using the goggles probably recognize some of these steps. They're probably already embedding them to some extent in a program where people are talking about things, where they're talking about severity. But understanding why these things are working the way they do allows us to boost the really important components and, again, lead to more sustained behavioral change. Again, goggles, they worked primarily by increasing susceptibility, but attitude, behavioral change doesn't just work through that. That increases threat. So that increases the benefit to some extent of changing behavior, but it doesn't address the perceived costs, the perceived barriers. It doesn't really address the subjective norms, nor the perceived control, and that's where self-efficacy comes in. That's where talking about these competing subjective norms, social norms comes in. This is where, having these really clear ways of dealing with these barriers, all of those will address the other four components, or the other three components of behavioral change. So paired with these other techniques, the goggles themselves should be more effective in causing attitude change and helping people follow through with it. We're providing people the tools for using this new information that the goggles provide, especially in the long term. Again, translating those intentions, helping them to become behaviors.
Now you have especially long-term question mark.
We can get rid of the question mark?
Yes. And is this like the methods that we've discussed? Is it like a cake recipe? Do we need all of these in order for this program to be effective?
I think that the more you have, the better off you are. So one of the things I talked about is attitude change occurs when we increase the benefits, when we decrease the barriers, when we deal with the subjective norms, and when we have people think they have control. If we address all four of those, we should be more effective in producing attitude change. But what we know is that even just addressing one, we found programs where you just put on the goggles, do a little exercise, and you're done, produce some attitude change. So the answer is yes and no. The more of this you can do, the better off you are, the better off people are in understanding what's going on, understanding why change matters, and having the right tools of dealing with it. So if you're going to plant a garden, it helps to have all the tools. You want a hoe and a shovel and seeds and all of those things. If you don't have one of them, you'll probably still have a garden. It just won't be quite as bountiful.
One of the holy grail in this regard is behavior change and getting them not to drink and drive, and I would anticipate that you're increasing the probability that you'll bring about that change by employing all of these various tools.
Definitely. Definitely. So again, we know goggles can create this intention. What we haven't seen is whether that intention becomes behavior. And first, increasing the intention through all of those different techniques, as well as helping that intention become a behavior by increasing their commitment to it, by giving them the tools they need so that when they're in situations, they can say, yeah, I don't want to drink and drive, and here's how I go about not doing it. Those will all hopefully increase that behavioral change long term.
We have employed these evidence-based approaches, which means these approaches have been used in other programs.
Mm-hmm.
Is it then necessary to take the resulting program that we've created using these techniques with Fatal Vision and also do an analysis or study of that program?
Ideally, yes. So ultimately what would be wonderful is to create this program and then do some kind of empirical test where we have a control group. We have a group who uses only the goggles not embedded in this program. And then we have a group that goes through this full program and then measure first short term, did we produce more behavioral or attitude change? And then a month or 2 months or 3 months later, are these people who go through this full program actually living up to their expectations? Are they fulfilling their intentions? So yes, to complete the circle, we would want to have that final step. But right now what we know is through theory, all of these different techniques should be effective. And what we know is that behavioral change is most effective when you target all four components of it. So we've given you a process, we've given you a theory-based process as to why this should work. To make it truly empirically tested, we do need that last step.
How important is the variable of the instructor themselves in delivery of this?
It's going to matter. So some people are going to be naturally better at motivational interviewing or be better able to connect with the people who are there. But with training, I think that we can limit that to some extent. And again, giving the people themselves who are going through this program the best tools that they have available. I think that this program, having a program versus not, the program is better. They have more tools. Having a great instructor versus not, the great instructor obviously is better as well. But this at least is a step in the right direction, giving people the same tools to work with.